really happy to meet all of you here. Today we will have the first start of international lecture series on evolutionary planning on capital habitats 2045. And we already have here Dr. Neville Mars, and we also have here Professor Riwandari Handayani as the head of Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Diponegoro University. Okay, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Riwandari to give a little bit opening remark for our international lecture series. Please, time is yours, Prof. Wiwi.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Ruko. I hope you can hear my voice clearly, from your place. Yeah, and good evening, everybody, and also our speaker tonight, our partner for uh, organizing this lecture series as part of our event to having a competition, on Nusantara Planning and Design. Dr. Neville, nice to having you both here with our participants tonight as the representative of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Diponegoro University. It's very pleasure for me to start our lecture series. Again, hopefully the lecture series not only will give you a better ideas on how we would like to later on continue with the Nusantara Planning and Design competition, but hopefully this lecture series will give in better ideas and innovative ideas on how we need to think further on planning the city in the future. As part of the 12 lecture series that we already planned and we already shared the info, we would like to start with our partner from the Mars Architects, with Dr. Neville, who are currently also regarded as the invited lecturer in our department, to give an initial information and on how we would like to push the innovative idea on the Nusantara as the new capital of Indonesia. So I do look forward for our tonight discussion and also for the next lecture series. We would like to have the 12 class until beginning of next year, and great to know that we will have a good speakers also from different institutions from different countries as well. And I am sure this is really a good opportunity for all of us to brainstorm ideas and gain new knowledge on the subject. So I think I will stop here and I will give the floor to Dr. Neville to give the brief presentations, and hopefully we can continue also with a fruitful discussion. So please, Neville, floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Wiwi. It's great to be here with you and with everybody online tonight. Let me share. It's always the tricky part. There we go, I think. No. One second. There we go. Can you see it?
Yeah.
It's very exciting to launch the first gathering of the EPOCH45 planning and design competition. With this lecture series, we hope to, let's say, give some feedback on, as Prof. Wiebig explained, a topic that is still largely overlooked and needs rigorous research and thinking. I'm very honored and proud to be here co-hosting with you, Prof. Wiebig and Prof. Ruku. We are going to enter this adventure together for the next 4 months, 4.5, and I hope everybody online will join us. Today is a brief introduction of what the lecture series entails, then my introduction on the topic of new towns with the title How to Be Holistic, and finally a brief Q&A. The title of the series is The Do's and Don'ts of New Town Planning. For the moment, that list is fairly short, and I hope we can extend it over the next months with a very impressive number of speakers from both Indonesia, Europe, and even Latin America. The lecture series is structured in 4 parts. The first month is essentially urban theory. Then the second month is about landscape urbanism, with the emphasis on landscape, because we feel as Nusantara aims to be a forest city, landscape should be our priority. And then scenario-based planning, because we are looking at the long-term future, 2045. So that means we cannot produce static fixed plans, but we need to find ways to be flexible and responsive. And finally, we will have a dedicated 2 sessions on Nusantara itself, discussion that leads up to the competition and helps participants to respond with an informed design. So today it is, I'm fortunate to say, it is my my turn. I can kickstart this process. I have to say I will launch with a fairly provocative statement. It is critical that we are approaching these things holistically, and yet again we don't really know how to do that. I've tried to break it down in my ABC of being holistic. The A is very simple. It's obvious. If we can avoid planning new cities, we would avoid many of the traps that are tagging along when you're planning from scratch. The B is, what is the essence of a new city? Can we avoid the intrinsic problems that come with new town planning? I would argue the essence of a new city, a plan from scratch town, is that they are blueprint planning projected on a green field. Now, interestingly, and maybe for many surprisingly, I'm going to argue that IKN, or Nusantara, the capital city, Nusantara, is not a blueprint, and it's not a greenfield. And finally, if that's the case, then what are the methods that we have at our disposal in order to respond to this not blueprint on a non-greenfield? I would argue it's land positive planning, land use management and land use integration, and evolutionary planning, allowing your scheme to evolve over time. This is, however, easier said than done, and that's because many of the core challenges that come with new town planning are very much at the fundamental concept of new towns themselves. The new city comes with so many pitfalls. I've listed a few here. I will run through them and try and highlight why they make our lives as planners so difficult. The first one is obvious. New towns have a pretty terrible historic global track record. And I think next week, Michelle Provost will, as an architectural historian, tap into this topic more deeply, and I hope she agrees with me. I've done my own sort of kind of cursory research, and I believe that if we look at 20 of the most sort of well-known eco-cities that are planned from scratch, 10 of them are really quite unsuccessful. Then there are about 6 that are maybe fairly reasonable, only it took them 25, 30 years to get to that point, at which stage they can no longer be considered new. So the new town as a concept as such is then no longer relevant. Now there are some successful ones. Interestingly, that is in 2 of them are in South Korea. And that sheds some light on why they might be successful. It seems that in an Asian, dense, fairly affluent, and at times in the beginning even booming liberal democracy, they can maybe thrive. In my definition, that means that they were able to be planned and built according to a scheme, according to a fixed plan, and within a reasonable amount of time, within about 10 years. Now, there are many examples that defy those a few successful ones. The most notable one is in the new prestige project in China, Xiong'an, which aims to be projected in this urban setting. Around 9 million was the initial goal. As you can see, my yellow dot is almost as accurate as it gets. It is a very hermetic and finite project projected on top of what is a very intricate, complex, and detailed setting. Now, if we look at that space a little bit more detailed, this is the north of China. I hope everybody can recognize it. That's Beijing in the middle and Tianjin in the south. 2 mega cities dotted with new town projects of the last 20 years. In my definition, none of them are truly successful, and many of them are rather unsuccessful. In fact, all 33 in this image could be considered as struggling. I will highlight 2 of them, Taofeidian and Xiong'an. Despite this track record, China is slated to plan another 285 new eco-cities, planned from scratch eco-cities. So it hasn't deterred them to build this rather large new prestige project between Beijing and Bao'an, Xiong'an. Even though the context here already begins to reveal it is a rather intricate one. It seems that a city of 7 million, downgraded from 9, can be projected without consequence onto this context. And this is a beautiful context. Xiong'an is proud to present you this image of lush green space, water, etc., on which a city of 3 times Manhattan, which is the closest to their description of scale, will be projected. And even though the context is so unique, the plans are not. This is a diagram of the master plan, and to me, it strikes me that it is similar as any modernist city we've seen over the last 80 to 100 years. A grid city with regular large roads in all directions, sometimes even 6 lanes. The main difference seems to be that it has incorporated some new technology. This is a driverless car and some funny scooters. So when your city is affluent enough, when your government is affluent enough, you can sort of upgrade your old plan with new technology. In this case, Xiong'an wants to build an underground train station with high-speed connections directly to Beijing and Tianjin, and even an underground park, as you see here. That's rather spectacular and would be helpful, but it doesn't deter from the fact that the morphology, the actual grid structure, the texture of the city hasn't changed since the last 80 years. If we go back and look at that dot and how it sits between these two mega cities, Beijing and Tianjin, it's almost impossible for us as planners to position that new dot, that new project, in a meaningful way. Either you're too far away from an existing economy, from an existing urban core, and your city is kind of withering away, which is currently the situation with Xiong'an. It's kind of lingering. Or you are too close to a mega city or a strong economic core, and invariably you're too successful, and your new town will grow towards that core and kind of blur with it. And this is not theory, this is very much actual practice. If we look at two cities from the 90s, Chongqing and Chengdu, and we glide through their development over the last 20 years, we see that despite all the planning, despite all the very detailed rubber-stamped, officially designed master plans, they have ignored all those schemes and followed their own urban gravity to grow towards each other. In my terminology, this is market-driven unintentional development, or MUD. That means we don't really have the means to control our own urban products. Let me show you at the scale of China what that entails. This is the Yangtze River Delta, with the largest core here, Shanghai, and then Suzhou, Hangzhou, etc. in 2000. In a mere 10 years' time, if you use GIS to calculate the surface area, you can see that it exactly doubled in footprint. So that's rather spectacular. While we plan those new eco-cities from scratch and project them on a piece of greenfield, in reality, the existing cities continue to march on. In fact, in these 10 years, only in Korea, an entire new city was built. In China, while these projects are being realized, suburbia unfolded. This is all the new urban tissue that was created, planned in those short 10 years. You can see that, again, there's no real coherence, there's no real structure to this, there's no master plan. And the same goes for other cities. We can quickly glide through them. This is Tianjin, where pink is in 2000, yellow is in 2010, the footprint, and blue is the new footprint by 2020. So the process changes, but exurbanization or suburbanization or fragments kind of launched to the far reaches of this urban system continue to grow. The same for Beijing, the same for Wuhan, very much happening between 2010 and 2020, all in blue. So if we want to control that, or if we want to outplan that process, there's a number of standard models at our disposal. And the new town is scenario one. I hope that these diagrams indicate it wouldn't be particularly effective. The new town planning, say 4 dots that absorb the amount of growth that is projected, wouldn't stop the expansion of the existing core. Maybe somewhat more effective is a sort of a ring close to the center with limited driving, limited infrastructure. Better yet, along that logic, is a sort of offset, a parameter growth that would take the existing footprint and just offset it a little bit all along its length. In reality, none of these three scenarios would unfold. What would happen most likely is what we saw in the previous diagrams, that the city kind of expands along its own accord. So we don't know how to plan them, and we don't really know what is a good city. That is even more fundamental, because if we do the kind of analyses, in this case, we looked at 9 major cities around the world, and we observed them for a number of parameters, then it seems to me that there is no such thing as an ideal city. This would be the star diagram that in my simple matrix would be sort of optimal. Hong Kong comes mighty close. I'm biased, but I do really like Hong Kong. Weirdly enough, the cities that I also really like, they are scoring very poorly in this diagram. For instance, Beijing, my favorite city. It's also a terrible urban system. So performance and experience are at odds with one another. We can make a system that performs well. It might not be the place where you want to live or work, and vice versa. So even though planners don't know what is a good city or how to design and plan it, increasingly it seems that leaders around the world do think they know how it's done. Interestingly enough, if you look at the red, most of the cities that are being planned from scratch as sort of top-down eco-cities are happening in more totalitarian or at least non-liberal democracy settings. The one here is interesting, designed by BIG from Denmark, for the king of Bhutan, who has a very clear idea what he wants to achieve. That is possible in his context because he can achieve, just as China, a level of society and economy engineering, shaping the society and shaping and sort of triggering the economy according to a plan, very much what we in democracies that more organically define their reality is not possible. So there is a disjunct between the theory and the practice, and yet it seems that, especially to leaders in those countries, China has done rather well. So it's very keen to kind of jump on board or jump on the Belt and Road to be part of that type of process and that type of progress, buying into the Chinese dream, buying into the Chinese model of urbanization, which is now being shipped across the Belt and Road, along the Belt and Road system, to well over 100 nations, having invested well over $1 trillion. In those countries, it is difficult to imagine such growth is not desirable. In those settings, it seems an ideal solution when China comes in with a large bag of money, the engineers and the designers, to offer you that planned solution. But even China has failed to kind of live up to its own projections. It seems extremely difficult for planners to predict the future. That's kind of counterintuitive, because cities, as they adapt and respond to new requirements, seem to be very effective in kind of changing and adopting to a new reality. If we look at this list organized by size, you see Xiong'an being amongst the largest, but initially it was 7 million. Initially, the line was 9 million. Very often, these projects start overly ambitious and then are scaled down. Xiong'an, interestingly, is roughly the same size as Nusantara IKN. population is about double, but it's still comparable. The line has no sensible metrics. It is just 170 kilometers long and 200 meters wide, and I think 500 meters tall. It defies all urban logic. Only 3.5 kilometers are currently built. So if we look at the projected kind of ideal or the aspired densities and sizes of these types of cities, let's look at them in the context of existing cities. IKN is a bit tricky and therefore much more interesting, because about 70% of its floor, of its footprint, would be forest. So even though the size is roughly the same as Chong'an, it's going to be concentrated on a third. But still, within this matrix, the densities are not very impressive. Look at the footprint of New York or even Manhattan. The densities correspondingly shoot up. Even IKN in this diagram is not very dense. It's not very compact. Maybe that green space will, as we start designing, will deter us from making a compact city. For now, we are still following the big dream of all these eco-cities, which somehow carry the burden to deal with all these global threats, all the kind of issues related to global warming, deforestation, flooding, etc., but also just acute housing crises. These types of global urgencies have introduced a kind of they've introduced an excuse for many planners and policymakers to present these concept cities that don't really have the science to back their design. In fact, I would argue that the world has changed so much that our initial planning models of cities with a center versus suburb do not thrive in a context that doesn't have much centrality. In short, the theories we rely on as planners kind of fail within the world as it is now emerging. And yet, this urbanism of urgency, these big threatening immediacies that we need to respond to, allow us to make increasingly ridiculous projects. The line is a great example. But it seems that every billionaire and his uncle wants their own new eco-city, new planned from scratch city. Richard Branson, Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. It's become the next big thing. Also locally here, we've had our share of attempts at planned from scratch new towns. This, I must admit, is also not just an American company, but an American-Dutch partnership. These projects have very honorable ambitions, but ultimately, even though they might be conceived as holistic as you might imagine, on the left here is a diagram of McKinsey for their resiliency index. So it looks truly complete and comprehensive and holistic. Even if you have those types of diagrams, at the end of the day, we must admit to ourselves that the new town can be understood as simply being a blueprint projected on a green field. In the case of McKinsey, if you're building these hermetic, resilient environments, you really have to wonder, are you reaching the people who are in need of rescuing the most? So the theory fails us, or rather this theory is no longer in touch with reality. The latest theories basically describe the city as a complex adaptive system, and I very much adhere to that. On the left is my own diagram, the notion that the city is this intensity that emerges at the crossroads of all these flows, the sort of critical mass, if you will. If it is indeed an intensity that emerges on the crossroads of flows, you can't really contain it. And in that rather abstract understanding, the city still needs to comply to very basic, even centuries old requirements. It needs to shelter, it needs to offer a place of exchange, and it needs to be tapped into resources, food, building materials, etc. So that means it needs to have a certain critical mass, it needs to have a certain level of connectivity, and it needs to be in touch with its context. However, so in modern terms, you could translate that, or fancy eco-city design terms, that's resiliency, complexity, and autarky. The last one is quite interesting, because if we're talking about resources, it is extremely difficult to be scientific about measuring if your city is indeed resilient or sustainable. With resources, you have a better grip. You can figure out if you're indeed independent, self-dependent. But most of these eco-cities are only independent, are only self-reliant within the confines of their computer models. They're kind of more like these, in this case on the left here, Renaissance vestiges that did one thing really well, protect us against, in this case, the enemy, the modern enemy of global exigencies, global warming, flooding, etc. Ultimately, they remain monofunctional. They do one thing pretty well. They're inward looking rather than outward looking. They're context averse and rigid. And this is not theory. This is very much the way these cities are planned and built. This is near Ordos in the east of China, where you see how the grid is rolled out in big quadrants and then filled in with blocks. This is an efficient way of attracting funding from the central government, and it's an efficient way of attracting funding from local investors to build a project, if the road is already there. But it installs within the urban fabric an extreme spatial simplicity, as you can see. In that type of framework, the smart city that you're designing, the eco-city that you're designing, is really disguising an old urbanism. It is really still just big roads connecting in a grid. So that's my little section A, no new cities. There are plenty more arguments to avoid them, but let's get to Nusantara. I mentioned I don't think Nusantara is that blueprint projected on a greenfield. The first step is the greenfield. That's fairly obvious. This is Borneo, Kalimantan, and the X is roughly where IKN Nusantara will be built. If you look at this island, it's the size of, it's just a little bit larger than France for the Europeans online. It's very sparse, not much population, but weirdly enough, it's surrounded by areas of extreme density. In fact, if you look, it's kind of a ring of density that has a radius of about 1,000 kilometers. So where I am now in Bali is around roughly 1,000 kilometers. So you're projecting onto an empty, at least in terms of population density, an empty slate. Is that correct? Yes, but there are certain local realities. It's a territory with its own hydrology. In this case, on the right, it is, you see all the different languages that are spoken. So there is a cultural context as well. So it's not a tabula rasa. In fact, it's not even a green field. This image, many of you will know it, is revealing the kind of gradual erosion of the natural landscape since, in this case, 1973 to today. The current context where Nusantara is built is not a tropical, diverse rainforest. It is actually what here is marked as non-forest, a monocrop of oil plantations and acacia trees. So it's not a green field because there is no forest. It's also not a green field or tabula rasa because, most importantly, the phase 1-4 administrative center of Nusantara is already built. These are the roads that have been constructed. And Pak Sofian of Urban Plus will talk about this in the pre-last session in this series. So if you have an existing core, by definition, it cannot be a greenfield. We are planning against something that exists, building on top or from something that is already constructed. Fast forward, which is quite long, where you can find it on YouTube. This is the intended outcome of phase 1 Smart Forest City, the administrative heart of the new capital. So it's not a greenfield because there is no forest, but there is already an urban core. What about the blueprint part? That's distinctly more difficult. I would argue that the main reason it's not a blueprint is that our mission and the official mission for the future of IKN is to seed this idea of a forest city. In other words, for the next 20 years, we're going to expand, grow, and evolve from this yellow core where phase 1 is being constructed to something that occurs within this red outline, within this red border. Where is to be discussed. The goal, 2 million over 20 years, will not happen at once, will very much be a gradual process. And the program or the land use is also not of a usual blueprint city. In this very simplistic diagram, I try to indicate it is some sort of mixture between urban and non-urban, between urban, nature, and agronomy or agroforestry, some combination of red, green, and blue. This diagram is slightly more accurate. It is less prescriptive in a box. We probably not going to see any boxes. It suggests that we can and we must acknowledge this entire area and somehow strategize how the correlations of these programs should occur and what their exact proportions will be. What we do know is that they happen simultaneously and that they have to have some sort of balance between them. So in that sense, it is a traditional city, not a planned from scratch eco-city. It is a city that must fulfill traditional needs. It has to have a critical mass, a capacity to house. It has to ensure safety, basically resilience. It has to somehow incorporate its future resources in food, energy, water, building materials, etc., medicine. And ultimately, it has to be a place of social cultural, and economic exchange. That's your basic definition of a city. And this would be very difficult, but the context has changed quite dramatically. Unlike Chinese eco-cities, there is no economic pressure cooker anymore. It's going to be slow. It is not primarily funded by global investments, so it can be and must be somehow bottom up. It can be projected on a distant locale because the initial inhabitants will be students and officials, the two groups that allow themselves to be relocated with not too much impunity. Ultimately, if there is an existing core, it is a responsive system. And if we are indeed able to restore the jungle, it's restorative, and maybe it can generate enough resources to be autarkic. The question is how. The template for that new city is unclear. How does it evolve from the current state of an administrative core to this future for a city by 2045? So in my third and final of the ABCs, I would argue the tools I have to offer, at least, are land positive planning and evolutionary planning. Land positive planning is essentially the idea that we integrate land use. Evolutionary planning is that we anticipate change, maybe even build in systems that embrace change. The standard diagram I use for a future eco-city is this. It has three parts: sustainability at the top, community at the bottom, very important. But for those who've listened carefully, I do not feel this type of hermetic model is very apt in dealing with this organic entity that is a city. So where do we start? I think the core has to be land use. And that doesn't make our lives harder, it makes it easier. If we look at land use for our new city, we can focus at two things that are fairly easy to measure and understand. Let's say time economy and space economy, or simply put, connectedness and compactness. Okay, but the landscapes we are dealing with now, as certainly in Indonesia, but in fact across Southeast Asia and across emerging economies, is so complex, so diverse, and so intricate that we can't really grasp the reality of these spatial systems. This is the Desa Kota just north of Jakarta. Luckily, we have new tools at our disposal. In this case, a thought model that is backed by GIS mapping using a cluster plugin that allows us to make sense of these rather complex and intricate red, green, and blue systems. But the beauty is, if we reduce that very complex environment, let's say the suburban landscape of Jakarta, and we reduce it to only 3 colors, we can begin to grasp what's going on, and then we begin to strategize for larger areas. So using this tool, and I want to stress that you don't need GIS to do this. You can also still do it, as I used to my whole career, through manual labor and just mapping it the old-fashioned way. You can understand these systems and reduce them to these, let's say, cocktails of different programs. If you have such a kind of reduced set of landscape typologies, your future strategy can be implemented across very large areas. So suddenly you have the means to work bottom up, where traditionally all our planning is top down. is centralized, is a blueprint. Now we can say, well, for instance, in this blue zone or this light gray zone or this orange zone, the logic, the spatial logics are probably similar. So if we have a solution that we kind of develop locally, it could be replicated across this orange zone. Here you see some other ones for Java. Now we've applied that logic to central Java. So here, the reality of top-down planning meeting bottom-up grassroots and informal development is very real and very tangible. This is the top-down reality. We need airports and seaports. We need toll roads to a certain degree. We need logistic centers, but they are super projected onto a landscape that is very active itself, that has its own kind of micro activities that follow an entirely different logic. So suddenly, these density spikes begin to respond to each other, grow towards each other, respond to new top-down planned items such as the new airport or the Borobudur as a new destination. So my premise is that using land use, we can make sense of that process and we can even guide that process. This is Central Java with our cluster map analyzed for a great number of different cocktails that we then reduce to only 5. Zooming in on one site here in that box, the Borobudur, we can see that if we would have a spatial strategy for that one envelope, we could replicate it across this orange area because our analysis suggests that the land use is similar, the land systems are similar. So we've done that. And in my first case study, to kind of back up my claim, I'd like to share this mapping of the Borobudur area. In the little black box here, the dot is the Borobudur. And we did extensive mapping, but I'll show only a few. We see that in this seemingly kind of universal landscape, there are certain hierarchies. There are places that are probably growing faster than others. There are places that are more accessible and less accessible. For instance, either by car or other ones by foot. So the traditional rural versus urban dichotomy that we as traditional planners used to rely on can be traced back even in this very, very intricate, seemingly universal system. The urban, accessible by car, the rural, by foot. According to that logic, we could begin to strategize a development scheme. In this case, we have red corridors where villages that are accessible by car become more urban and embrace urban activity and also maybe industrialization, whereas the green bubbles that are accessible for pedestrians and bikes and scooters remain kind of protected, remain local, remain green, and still are able to tap into those red zones. Here you see one of them. This is an actual village with its green corridors that are revived in order to allow people to walk from one village to the next without having to use, for instance, a highway. So suddenly, what seemed to be a vast and almost incomprehensible fabric becomes much more human, more local, more understandable. Now, I hear you think, yeah, that's great, but new towns are the product of developers. And developers like cars because people like cars, and maybe this is all only viable in some rural context. Maybe. That's a fair argument. I would like to suggest there are some alternatives. But if we want to rid ourselves of the car, and in the second talk of this month, Lior and Barend Koolhaas will tap into urban mobility. We see that if we radically rethink the master plan of the city and introduce this evolutionary process, we could probably avoid our dependency on these very road-centered systems. So we were invited to design an alternative for Taipei, the city I showed you in the beginning next to Beijing, Tianjin. The original map on the left here, very traditional, very road-oriented, and yet supposedly a green city. We suggested that we couldn't really take that map and replace it for another map that we, as a single team, would then define top-down and say, that's our new ecosystem. We suggested that instead we should redesign the planning process itself. So to install a sense of evolution, we install it within the planning process. To do that, we invited 9 other companies, very formidable ones, including Urbanus, BAU, ZUS from Holland, MAD from China, etc. Instead of asking them to each design one corner of that future city, as is common practice, we suggested they should design one after the other, passing the file along in the computer in 3D from one office after a few weeks of working on it to the next, etc. So they all had very different ideas of what is an eco-city. That in itself is already kind of mind-boggling. There is no singular understanding. There is a plethora of ideas and kind of aspirations of what the future of the eco-city should or could be. In this case, ZUS introduces a beautiful kind of landscape urbanism type solution of dikes and houses on those dikes, and even floating pontoons, etc. So we have a range of designers working on top of each other, kind of even deleting previous solutions or parts of designed areas, in a way replicating the growth of a real city, in a way simulating the evolution of a city. That is a type of inherent complexity that you cannot design as a single team, not even the best in the world. So what you get is a number of really shifting directions of this evolving eco-city of Taipei as it in the computer grows from 2020 in 3-year increments to 2040. In this case, towards the end, Maya Song, MAD, feels there is enough economic momentum to do a grand gesture, which then is kind of undone by the final participant also taking part in this lecture series, MVRDV, who suggested, well, we need to be sustainable, we need to recycle that space and occupy those buildings. So what you see is a very rapid transition here. I'll click through it team by team. It starts simple, then landscape urbanism kicks in, infrastructure, walking and biking come into play, new forms of housing, new neighborhoods that are kind of organically growing, an entirely new energy system, a new center, CBD, if you will, and ultimately a city that is, even though it's utopian, has enough to teach us about what of these ideas are in the future maybe desirable and maybe not. It kind of allows us to make our mistakes that in the real world, in the real city, cannot be made because the city can't be undone. The city is not an empirical product. I think this is probably my closing case study, or maybe pre-closing. I have a simple definition for myself what planning should entail and should be about. It's connecting people, connecting systems, and connecting space. That's it for me. In the case of the master plan for Mumbai, we came to discover that sometimes that is easier said than done, because the city you're dealing with has a hidden city within. Here in red, the slum areas or informal areas are 2/3 of the population of Mumbai, but yet they only occupy 1/3 of its service area. So it is kind of a hidden city within the city. We wanted to explore that in more detail and made a big model out of it and kind of analyzed what that meant. And we discovered that indeed the densities within these informal areas are extreme, as indicated in yellow here, and that they are everywhere. Here you can see it. So what do we do in that context in terms of reconnecting people, places, and systems? If we look at the largest of those informal settlements, and the most famous one, Dharavi, it's kind of locked in by infrastructure, train tracks, roads, water, sewage. And yet all that infrastructure makes these people have less access to the rest of the city instead of more. It's so bad that it impedes their daily lives. There is a sort of time scarcity. They can't achieve all the things they need to do within one day because there's so much to traverse, so many tracks and pipelines and infrastructure to traverse to get to their destination. At the same time, all those informal settlements seem to impede on the regular formal city and their transportation needs. So there was a large top-down central plan envisioned to build a new city next to the Mumbai island city here on the left, Navi city. And the idea would be that we could relocate all 7 million people living on the right here in this sort of informal hidden capital within this urban jungle. And it's that kind of comparison that feels to me it's relevant to our situation in Nusantara. We have a very rich, diverse ecosystem, the city, which is in many ways similar to the diverse, rich ecosystem of the forest we aim to achieve. And within that is this urban, scattered capital, an informal capital. So what we proposed in this scenario is rather than having a split city, we would have a twin city. Rather than forcing people to move to Navi and create an insane amount of daily commutes over a vast trajectory, over a vast distance, causing more traffic, which has been the case and has happened, we said we formalize this kind of hidden capital in this urban jungle. We formalize it by connecting it first to itself. So we mapped these informal settlements and started figuring out what the best options are to connect them and create an intricate network of pockets of settlements. And there's much of infrastructure already in place. there's these skywalks that exist and can be utilized to create a new network. And they can be improved through design. And we can add new infrastructure, but this time not avoiding the slums and informal settlements, but actually providing access by reaching the densest areas in this informal map. Maybe even a little bit utopian, we can add new skyways, skywalks for pedestrians, but also for scooters and tuk-tuks and tricycles, etc. More importantly, it's about utilizing the infrastructure and the ecology that is already there. And I believe in Nusantara, there is already a lot there. Here you see a new connection on a pipeline. Suddenly, all those isolated fragments of informal city are reconnected to form an actual connected tissue, to form a more formal counterpart to Mumbai's island city. So with that, I think we should move to sort of round up. I don't know if how we want to do that. Maybe we can address some questions. Let's see. Rafi, should we, or Paruku, should we do some questions?
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much, Neville, for your nice presentation. And I think it's very opening eye presentations for the introduction about evolutionary planning. And I already give some notes in our chat box for anyone who has questions about the topics, and as well as questions about the competition is open for you in the next couple of minutes, I think. Please, if you have any question, you can either put it in this chat box, or you will express directly to Dr. Neville. Please.
If there is no questions, then we can assume that everybody's clear with the explanations. And actually, I hope this first lecture will a bit somehow provoke all the participants to join the competitions, yeah. To continue with the ideas.
One question coming
This
Christopher Espina. Will we be able to get existing plans of the phase 1 of IKN? So it's basically about the competition. Maybe in addition to answer these questions, maybe Dr. Neville, you can explain about a little bit about the competitions.
Yeah, so on the practical side, there is already online a database. So if you register, if you sign up at the website epoch45.org, you will have access to the full database, including maps, papers, and also there is a dialog box to ask questions, so that all that material will be available. And of course, during the coming presentations, we will go into much more detail about the existing plans of IKN. I see one question. Yeah, that's at the heart of the challenge. How can you balance long-term vision and kind of avoid the mistakes of predetermining too soon? The first answer I tried to kind of give, but I also didn't want to be too explicit today because it's more about, as what Vivi says, it's more about provoking at this stage than about giving clear-clad answers. The first and simplest solution is by kind of not preempting a certain fixed solution. So if you don't have to answer how big the city will be, then don't answer it. If you don't have to define where a tram line must be, then don't define it. If you don't want to kind of determine the final size, then don't determine it. And for all these scenarios, there are kind of gradual and incremental descriptions that are equally effective. Let me see, there's another question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important question. How do you think we can ensure that this ambitious development of IKN strikes a balance between embracing futuristic technology and preserving local culture and community? In the context of EPOCH45, is there a way to ensure that this city envisioned for the future still retains a human-centric approach without being overshadowed by technological innovation? I'm very, very glad you asked that. I hope I was clear enough in my, dare I say, disdain. Certainly, my skepticism of a technocentric approach. I believe that technology has its own time and place, but land use, land management, land integration is first and foremost in everything we do. And if you agree with my methodology, that requires mapping, including cultural and socio-spatial mapping. I showed some language map, for instance, that taps into existing cultures. But in a nutshell, technology is, in my opinion, no safeguard for sustainability. I think as the fourth presentation will suggest, nature-based solutions are able to cover or at least mitigate most of the issues and address most of the demands that a future city might have without heavy technology, without sort of rigid sclerotic systems put into place top-down. Yeah, that's a great question.
I think if there is no more questions, then we can end our sessions tonight, maybe.
Yeah.
Neville?
I will
Yeah.
put online one more time the QR, if that's okay.
Yeah,
And
sure.
that's
Yeah, and for all the participants who are still joining us, just want to emphasize a bit more that if you would like to have more information on data and everything, as Pak Neville has mentioned before, please just register for free now, and you will get the access to all the data, and you can ask questions through the website and the platform that already provided. Yeah, but is it correct, Pak Neville?
absolutely. No, absolutely. So I think you will wrap up, but let me just say thank you all. There were almost, I think 96, there were almost 100 people online. just now. I think that's wonderful, and that is basically due to all the efforts both of you have made, Pak Ruko and Pak Vivek. That's my big thanks to you guys.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Pak Ruko, as well. Yeah, Pak. Look forward to continue with the following lecture series. I believe that we will still have another 11 to the early next year, and it will be every Tuesday, right? Tuesday night Jakarta time, and we will try to manage only for like a short but fruitful presentation and discussion, maybe around 60 minutes. We have plus 10 minutes for tonight, yeah, for the Q&A. I think that's all, yeah, Pak Ruko. Do we miss some informations before we really close all the sessions?
Yes, I think maybe we need consider whether we need to expand the capacity of Zoom. I think there are some more that would like to join, but our capacity set at 100. So maybe.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
evolving gradually, right?
hopefully. Uh, we can consider that for the next series, yeah. Okay.
Thank you
Thank you
so much.
very much, Panevil, Faruko, and
Thank you,
all the
everybody.
participants here. Hope to meet you
See
again
you next week.
in the next series. Yeah, next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.